In the spring of 1891, in a mill town pressed between two rivers in eastern Tennessee, a woman's name was ruined in the space of an afternoon. Not by her actions, not by her words, by a lie that traveled faster than the truth ever could. Harriet Breen had worked the Garrett textile mill for 11 years. She knew the looms the way some women knew scripture. By feel, by sound, by the small variations that warned of trouble before trouble arrived. She could hear a tension fault in a thread before the frame skipped. She could read the mood of a machine the way a doctor reads a pulse. The mill foreman, a thick-necked man named Douglas Pell, had relied on that knowledge for years without once saying so aloud. When Harriet reported that Pell had been skimming from the wage ledger, shorting the widows on night shift, pocketing the difference in small amounts that added to large ones. She had done it quietly, in writing, and with 3 years of numbers to support the claim. By the following Thursday, Pell was still employed. Harriet was not. The notice was handed to her at the gate. Dismissed for cause, conduct unbecoming. The words were polite enough that they could mean anything. In a town where the mill owned the boarding houses, the company store, and the goodwill of the aldermen, they meant everything. By Saturday morning, every woman she had called a neighbor knew a version of the story. Most of it wrong, all of it worse than the truth. She endured it the way she had endured other things. Quietly, with her back straight and her hands steady, and something aching behind her ribs that she did not allow herself to name. The forge sat at the north end of town, close enough to the river that the water softened the sound of it. It had belonged to Gideon Marsh for 7 years, since he came down from the hills after his wife passed and settled into a trade he had learned from her father. He was not a large man, but the work had made him solid. His hands were marked with old burns, minor ones, the kind that came from decades of proximity to heat rather than carelessness. He did not speak much, he did not need to. A forge spoke for itself. The morning Harriet Breen first appeared at his gate, Gideon was reshaping a plow blade for the feed store on 2nd Street. He heard the gate latch and turned without urgency. She stood very still. Her coat was clean but old. Her eyes moved to the work, not to him, and there was something in that, an attention to the thing being made rather than to the man making it, that made him lower the hammer for a moment. "I'm looking for piecework," she said. "I can carry, sort, file, keep ledgers. I'm told you work alone." "I do," he said. "I won't cause trouble." He looked at her a moment longer than politeness required. He had heard the talk, the way everyone had heard it. Small towns did not allow a person to remain unknown. He knew her name. He knew the shape of the story being told about her, and he knew, in the way that a man who had watched his own name get bent and distorted after grief knew, that the shape of a story and the truth inside it were often very different things. "Ledger work," he said. "I keep poor records." "I know," she said, and something in her tone, not smug, not unkind, just precise, told him she had looked before she asked. He set the plow blade aside. "Mornings only. I work in the afternoons without interruption." "That suits me." He nodded once and returned to the blade. Harriet let herself in through the gate, found the stool near the supply shelf, and began without being told which piles needed attending to first. He did not ask her about the mill. She did not offer. For 2 weeks the arrangement was as plain as its terms. She arrived before 7. She worked until noon. The ledgers, which had been a disaster of receipts and margins and half-finished columns, began to take shape. She did not comment on the disorder. She simply fixed it. Gideon noticed things. He noticed that she worked without looking up when the neighbor's boy came to stare through the fence slats. He noticed that she thanked him at the end of each morning in the same tone she had used at the beginning, neither warmer nor cooler, as if she had decided on a register and intended to hold it. He noticed that she flinched, only slightly, when a man's voice rose in the street outside. He did not remark on any of it. On a Tuesday morning in April, she found an error in a supplier invoice, an overcharge so precise it could not have been accidental. She brought it to him at the anvil, holding the paper level. He studied it. looked at her, looked back at the paper. "How long has he been doing this?" he asked. "At least 2 years," she said. "Possibly 3. The pattern changes enough to avoid pattern recognition by someone who doesn't know what to look for." Gideon set down his tongs. "And you know what to look for?" "Yes." He called the supplier that afternoon and said what needed to be said without flourish. The overcharges stopped. He did not tell Harriet what was said. He did not need to. She had already moved on to the next set of records. But that evening, after she had gone, he stood at the window of the forge and thought about what it meant to have eyes that sharp and no one willing to trust them. The town talked, of course. It always did. The forge was not a respectable enough establishment for the mill owners' wives, but it was frequented by enough men with opinions that those opinions circulated. A woman dismissed for cause, helping herself to work at the blacksmith's. The story took on whatever shape suited the teller. A few were generous, most were not. Harriet heard what was said about her in the usual ways. Through silences that appeared where conversation had been. Through glances that moved away too quickly. Through the butcher's wife, who had once been a friend, and was now something more complicated, and who said one morning at the market, with a voice that managed to sound kind while doing damage, "I just hope you know what you're doing is all. You can't afford another mistake." Harriet paid for her flour and eggs and walked home. She did not cry. She had learned that tears in public were read as confirmation of whatever people had already decided to believe. She saved them for the walk behind her house, in the narrow strip between the fence and the garden where no one passed. The truth of the matter, which she told no one, was this: she had not been reckless. She had not acted out of spite, or ambition, or any desire for conflict. She had watched the widows on the night shift count their envelopes and come up short, month after month, and she had done the arithmetic that they were too exhausted to check. Pell had counted on exhaustion. He had been right until he wasn't. She would not unsay what she'd said. Not for her reputation, not for a reference, not for anything. The complication arrived in the form of a man named Alderman Croft. He was not an alderman by title, that was simply what people called him, because he had sat on the town board for long enough that the role had become his name. He had money in the mill, money in the company store, and money, it turned out, in the supplier account. Harriet had exposed at the forge. He came on a Wednesday, without introduction, and leaned against the fence post with the ease of a man accustomed to being received. "I've come to make a proposal," he told Gideon, his eyes sliding to where Harriet worked at the supply table. "There are people in this town who have concerns about the character of certain individuals employed in certain establishments." He paused to let the weight of that settle. It would be in everyone's interest if those concerns were addressed. Gideon set down his hammer. He did not move toward the man. "Say plainly what you've come to say." Croft smiled. "Let her go, or find the next 6 months of permits more difficult than they need to be." The forge was quiet except for the creak of the fire. Harriet had not stopped working, but her shoulders were very still. Gideon picked up his hammer again. "Close the gate when you leave," he said. Croft's smile thinned. He left. Harriet did not look up from the ledger until she heard the latch click. Then she did, and she found Gideon already back at the anvil, his attention on the iron, his jaw set in a way that suggested he was done with the conversation and meant to remain that way. "You understand what he'll do," she said quietly. "Yes." She set down the pen. "I won't cost you the permits. I'll finish this week's work and—" "Finish this week's work," Gideon said without looking up. "And next week's. The ledgers are a month behind." She was silent. "I'm not keeping you out of kindness," he added. "The ledgers were a disaster before you came. Keeping you is the sensible choice." The words were matter of fact. They were not warm. But Harriet understood them as a kind of truth she had not been offered in some time. An honest accounting, without sentiment, without pity. He was keeping her because she was useful, yes, but he was keeping her when the cost of doing so had become real and visible. There was a difference, she decided, between being kept because no one had noticed the cost yet, and being kept when someone had weighed it clearly and chosen anyway. She returned to the ledger. The permits did become difficult. 3 applications delayed. A fire safety inspection conducted twice in 1 month. Gideon said nothing about it where anyone could hear. He filed the paperwork again. He passed the second inspection as he had passed the first, because the forge was, in fact, in excellent order. But Harriet was not unaware of the pressure building around her name. She heard the word indecent used in the feed store, applied to the situation of a woman spending her mornings at a man's place of business. She heard it twice more that week. She began leaving by the back gate to avoid the cluster of men who sometimes gathered near the post office across the street. One evening she stayed past noon to finish reconciling the supplier accounts. The afternoon light fell across the work table in long bar. Gideon was behind her at the forge, working steadily, the sound of it familiar now in the way that a clock becomes familiar, present without demanding attention. "You knew," she said, not turning around. "Before you hired me. You knew what the town was saying." The hammer slowed, stopped. "I knew," he said. "Why then?" It was not quite a question. She had learned that questions left room for deflection. Statements left room for truth. Gideon set the piece down. He wiped his hands on the leather apron. Several seconds passed before he spoke. "My wife's name was Grace," he said. "She died in the winter of '83. Fever. It came fast." He paused. Afterward, there was talk. The kind of talk people make when they don't know what else to do with their discomfort. "I learned that a lie, told often enough in a small place, stops needing to be true." Harriet turned then. "Your numbers were right," he said, and that was all. She nodded. The forge fire breathed low between them. Neither of them said anything more that afternoon. But something had been named that had been present for weeks without a name, and the naming of it changed the shape of the air. In May, Douglas Pell filed a formal complaint with the town board. The document was 5 pages, carefully worded, and described Harriet as having been dismissed for tampering with company records. It named the forge as a location of continued irregular conduct. It was designed, clearly, to reach the right ears by the right route. Gideon was called to a meeting he had not requested. He went alone. He sat in the chair across from 3 men he had done work for over the years, men who wore the familiar faces of people who know they are doing something wrong and have decided to proceed anyway. "This situation has drawn attention," one of the men said, his voice careful with practiced neutrality. Gideon waited. "The woman has a history of causing disruption. The board has concerns about the associations you've chosen to maintain." "The woman found an invoice fraud that has been costing this town's businesses for 3 years, Gideon said. He had not raised his voice. He did not need to. "I have the records." A pause. "I also have the original wage ledgers Harriet Breen kept at the mill before her dismissal," he continued. "I've had copies made. One set is held by my attorney in Knoxville." The room was quiet. "I don't expect any further permit difficulties," Gideon said. He stood, nodded once in the way of a man who has said what he came to say, and left. The difficulties stopped. Harriet did not know what had been said in that room. She knew only that the inspections ceased and the permit delays resolved themselves, and that Gideon returned from town that afternoon, hung his coat on the hook, and returned to work without remark. She asked him that evening, quietly, what he had said. "The truth," he said, "with documentation." She was still for a moment. "You could have simply let it go." "No," he said, "I couldn't." She understood him then, more fully than she had understood him before. This was not a man who acted from impulse, or from sentiment, or even from particular feeling toward her. He was a man who acted from principle, from a settled conviction about what was right, in the same steady way that he returned every morning to a fire that had to be coaxed back to life. It was not romantic. It was something more reliable than romantic. June arrived with heat. The work had found a rhythm that no longer required explaining. Harriet ordered supplies, reconciled the accounts, and had begun, without being asked, to draft a pricing schedule that would end the informal haggling that ate into Gideon's margins. He reviewed it one morning in silence, then set it beside the cash box without comment. One afternoon she heard voices from the street. Men gathered near the gate. She recognized one, a former colleague from the mill, a man who had always been careful to stand where the wind was blowing. His voice carried the amused certainty of someone performing for an audience. "Charity work," he said. "That's all it is. Man feels sorry for her." Laughter, easy without weight, the kind that asked nothing of the people who made it. Harriet set down her pen. She did not go to the gate. She did not answer. She sat with her hands flat on the table for a moment, breathing through the familiar tightening in her chest. Behind her she heard Gideon move to the forge door. "There's nothing here that concerns you," he said to the street. His voice was not loud. It was precise, a pause. The kind of pause that recalibrates the air. The voices moved on. Gideon came back inside and picked up his tongs without looking at her. She did not thank him. She understood that he would not have wanted thanks for a thing he considered plainly necessary. Instead, she picked up her pen and returned to the pricing schedule. And the silence between them was different than the silences before. Not empty, but full of something that neither of them was quite ready to call by name. In July, the mill's new superintendent came to the forge on what he called an informal visit. He was younger than Pell, with a manner that suggested he had been sent to assess rather than to threaten. He watched Harriet work for a few minutes from the doorway, then spoke to Gideon in a low voice about a clerical position that had recently opened. "Paying work," he said. "Legitimate, visible, better for her reputation than—" He gestured vaguely at the forge. Gideon looked at Harriet. He did not speak for her. She answered without standing. "I've heard what the mill pays for clerical work," she said. "And I've seen what happens to women who report irregularities in your ledgers. Thank you." The superintendent left. Gideon said nothing, but when he handed her wages that Friday, he had added a full day's pay to the end of the week without comment or explanation. She held the envelope for a moment. Then she folded it into her coat pocket and said, "This is more than the agreed amount. The pricing schedule saved me $14 last month," he said. 40% of that is yours." She looked at him. He was already back at the anvil. "That's not what we agreed," she said. "The agreement didn't account for work I didn't know to ask for," he said. She did not argue. She understood by now that Gideon Marsh did not make adjustments for sentimental reasons. He adjusted when the accounting demanded it. The fact that the accounting was honest and the adjustment was fair, that was enough. More than enough for a woman who had spent years being used carefully and compensated barely. August came. The river ran low. The forge was hot enough in the afternoons that Harriet sometimes brought water to the doorway and left it without being asked. He drank it without comment. That was how things were between them. Useful, direct, without performance. And then the flood warning came down from the ridge. It arrived on a Thursday evening in the form of a neighbor's boy running between houses with news that the upper tributaries had backed up behind a debris dam, and the dam was not expected to hold. By nightfall, the lower streets were already showing water. The mill sent notice at 9 that all workers were to report to sandbag positions at dawn. The forge, being north and higher, was less immediately threatened. But the supply warehouse where Gideon kept 6 months of iron stock sat at the river's edge. Harriet appeared at the warehouse before dawn. She had not been asked. She had simply looked at the geography and understood what the water would do. Gideon was already there, moving stock to the upper shelves, his face set with the controlled effort of a man working faster than he wanted anyone to see. He stopped when he saw her. "You don't have to be here," he said. "I know the inventory," she said. She pulled on the gloves she had brought and went straight to the shelf nearest the door, the one holding the most vulnerable stock. "What goes up first?" he told her. She moved. They worked through the morning in the rising damp, the water creeping along the floor boards. The sound of the river rising to something that was no longer background noise. Other men arrived. Two of Gideon's regular customers, a neighbor, a boy of about 16, who wanted to help and was given the job of moving the lightest pieces to the wagon. Harriet directed them without announcement, without title, simply because she knew what the inventory was and where it needed to go. And the clarity of that knowledge organized the room around her. The dam broke at mid-morning. The water came fast and cold and brown. The warehouse floor took 6 inches in under an hour. They had moved most of the stock. What remained was too heavy to shift without equipment they didn't have. Harriet stood at the door watching the water behind her. The men were catching their breath. One of them said, half to himself, "Damn, would have lost the whole stock without the head start." She heard Gideon behind her before she felt the brief warmth of his presence at her shoulder. "You knew the inventory better than I did," he said quietly. "Not praise exactly, an accurate statement." "I kept the records," she said. "That's not why." She turned. He was watching her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not wonder, he was not the wondering kind. More like recognition. Like a man who has finally located something he had been trying to name for a long time. She looked away first. Outside, the water was still rising. When the flood receded, the town assessed what had been lost. The mill's lower floor had taken serious damage. Several households near the river had lost furniture, stores, livestock. The supply warehouse had lost perhaps 15% of its stock. Compared to what might have been, it was a minor accounting. Word traveled, as it always did. This time, the word was different. Several of the men who had worked in the warehouse that morning repeated the same basic story in different places over the following days. That Gideon Marsh's ledger keeper had known the inventory cold and organized the save before the worst came. The butcher's wife said something more tentative than she had been before when Harriet's name came up. The neighbor who had avoided her doorstep since spring sent a jar of preserves without explanation. Harriet did not mistake this for vindication. She had learned not to trust a town's goodwill when it came conditioned on her usefulness. But she received it with a bitterness which was its own kind of progress. It was a Sunday in September when Alderman Croft returned. He came to the forge this time, not to the gate. He came alone and without his prior ease, which told Harriet, watching from the supply table, that something had changed in the geometry of his position. "I came to speak to you," he told Gideon. Then, more carefully, "to you both." Harriet set down her pen. Croft did not preamble. "The supplier arrangement has come apart in ways I'd rather resolve quietly. Marsh, you have documents I'd prefer not to see in a courthouse. I'm prepared to make a settlement that includes a formal retraction of the complaint filed against." He gestured toward Harriet without quite looking at her, the dismissed employee. Gideon looked at Harriet. She said, "The retraction has to name the original complaint as false. In writing, filed with the board." Croft's jaw tightened. "That's a strong word. It was a false complaint," she said simply. "I'll use the word that fits." A silence stretched. Croft was calculating. She watched him do it and felt nothing for his discomfort. "Fine," he said at last. "And the wages shorted from the night shift workers," she said. 3 years of the difference, distributed back. I have the figures." Gideon had not moved. He was watching her with the same still attention he gave to something being made in the fire. Present, steady, exact. Croft's face went rigid. Then something in him settled. A man who has held a position too long and feels it slipping off often chose capitulation over warfare when the accounting became too clear to argue. "Done," he said. After he left, the forge was quiet for a long moment. Then Gideon said simply, "You had those figures ready." "For months," she said. He nodded slowly. It was not admiration in his expression. It was something more careful than that. The look of a man who is adjusting an estimate he had already revised upward several times. October came in cool and dry. The work continued as it had. Mornings only, ledgers and accounts, and the occasional supplier correspondence. The forge had its rhythms, and Harriet had fit herself to them so completely that there were days when the arrangement felt as permanent as a thing could feel without being spoken, which was why she was surprised, one Friday morning, when Gideon set down his tools at mid-morning and sat down across from her at the supply table. He did not often sit. When he did, it was deliberate. She waited. He was quiet for longer than she expected. She had learned not to rush his silences. "I'm not going to pretend this is a business arrangement anymore," he said at last. She held very still. "I know what I hired you because," he said, "and I know what it's become." He paused. "I'm not asking you to name it the same way I do. I'm not asking anything, but I won't sit across from you every morning and pretend I'm only keeping records." Harriet set down her pen. Outside, the town moved in its ordinary Friday rhythms. "I lost my name once," she said quietly. "I built it back, slowly and by myself. I won't risk it for sentiment." "I know," he said. "I'm not offering sentiment." She looked at him. The forge fire was low. The morning light came through the high window and fell across the work table between them. "What are you offering?" she asked. "Clarity," he said. "Partnership. Whatever this already is, named properly." She had waited many years for someone to name what was there, rather than pretend it wasn't. She had spent those years learning that what she needed was not rescue, not gallantry, not someone to make things easier, but someone who would look at the full accounting of who she was and find it acceptable. More than acceptable, necessary. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded and stood, and returned to the forge without another word. No pressure, no pursuit. He had said his piece and left the decision with her, as clearly as he had ever left anything. She sat for a long while after, her hands still on the table, the pen beside them. They were married in November. No ceremony to speak of. The minister, a plain-speaking man who had known Gideon since the early grief years, read the words in the front room of the forge house with 2 witnesses present. A neighboring woman who had sent the preserves and the 16-year-old boy who had moved stock during the flood and who looked very serious about the whole business. Afterward, Gideon shook the minister's hand. He took Harriet's hand and held it briefly with the same deliberate quality he brought to everything. Not tentative, not dramatic. Certain. She let herself be certain back. The board's formal retraction was filed 3 days later. The wages were distributed to the night shift workers before the end of the month. 3 women came separately to the forge gate to thank her. She received them without flourish. She knew the accounting, and it was theirs, not hers. In December, a young woman appeared at the gate one morning. She was perhaps 20, with the tight expression of someone who had been carrying something they didn't know how to put down. She said she worked at the mill and had a number that wasn't adding up. Harriet looked at her for a long moment. Then she stepped back and opened the gate. "Come in," she said. "Tell me what you've found." And in that gray December morning, with the forge breathing low behind her and the river moving along its familiar course at the edge of town, Harriet Breen. Harriet Marsh now, though both names felt true, understood that the town that had called her a liability had finally learned what she had always been. Not a problem to be managed. Not a name to be whispered. A resource, a record keeper. A woman who knew what the numbers said and was not afraid to say it plainly. She had not waited for the town's permission to know her own worth. She had simply continued working until the truth caught up with the accounting.